just going to give are we okay on the video? Great. I'm just going to give a short little talk on the C preprocessor. The Arduino IDE uses GCC as its compiler. And so it runs the C preprocessor on your source code. First it does some of its own massaging on your source code. It doesn't really tell you how they do that. Sometimes that causes problems. Then runs through the C preprocessor and then the compiler gets changed in. And so you've probably already seen these things like pound include, where you want to include a library file, library header file. And then pound define for defining various constants, things like that. So those are, you've already been using the C preprocessor even if you didn't know it. But there are some other directives that the C preprocessor understands. One that I use quite often is my code. If I have code that I'm compiling for a particular board, an ATtiny84 for example, it has a different set of pins than an Arduino Uno would have. And so if I'm writing ATtiny code, I put something like this at the beginning of the my source code, and then if I try to compile it in the IDE, and I've got the board set to an Uno or a Leonardo or something like that, it'll get to this point, and this pound error will generate an error during the compilation, and it will not compile, and you'll get this message. This code is for an ATtiny84.
It's an actual useful error? That's crazy talk.
Well, it's the first error. So if you go look at the first error, it will tell you what you did wrong. But it continues past that, and what you'll see is like the last error, or if there's more than 100, you'll see the 99th or the 100th. And you have to know to scroll back up to the top to see what the original issue was.
There's a flag
Yes,
you
Jim.
said,
So why is the format for these pound statements different than all the rest of the lines in the program where you put semicolons after things and there's a different syntax, like equals when you're assigning a value to a variable?
Yep. Okay, so this is run by the preprocessor. It doesn't pass through the text file, right? And doing substitutions, pulling in the pound include files, and greatly expanding your source program into the input that's actually sent to the compiler. And so the compiler never sees these lines that start with pounds. And so, like where was, instead of LED pin, pound define LED pin 13, it will, everywhere it sees LED pin, it will replace it with the text 13. Okay, so the compiler never sees LED pin, it just sees a 13.
So those pound lines that start with pound are specifically for the preprocessor,
Yes.
and that's why they have a different syntax and formatting.
Correct.
Yeah, they're never
They're
seen
not
by the
seen by
compiler
the
itself.
Okay,
The
got it.
compiler doesn't see, it only sees the text that comes out of the preprocessor.
Okay.
Yes, Scott.
If anyone has a Linux system that they're doing their Arduino on, or Sigwin, something like that, you can play with the same preprocessor on any text file. It's called M4. The M4 preprocessor acts just like this one.
Okay.
And it has a
Different.
completely different syntax, but it is a preprocessor.
Oh, the one that I'm used to has the same C syntax,
The,
but okay.
the C
You can run the
preprocessor
C
is,
preprocessor.
it's called
on
C,
any
you can run it,
CPP, on any file.
CPP. Yeah.
Never mind.
One of the things I frequently do is if I have one set of code that I want to run on an ATtiny84, which has different numbers of pins and where the LED is different versus if I want to run it on an Uno, I do these check to see which, so one of the things that the Arduino IDE does is it sets up some definitions for you. And one of them is what kind of processor is on the board that you're compiling for. So when you select in the menu, I want to do this such and such board, it will define a bunch of things, and one of them is what kind of processor it's on. And so that's what I usually do to distinguish between my project types.
Is there a handy way to get all of the names out of, or is that obvious?
It's not obvious, it's hidden.
Deep,
I
deep, deep, and-
dug for a while and never really found where it was, but there is in some supporting slides at the end here, I have a great place to go look for these strings.
Thank you.
Various types of processes.
Redefine macros.
It's not quite that good. It's the macros for the processor types.
Going back to the previous one, with the cascading error issue, one approach might be, just by convention, to have inside that define, in conjunction with the error, you could say pound define fatal, right? And after the am I sane checks, you know, am I running the right chip or whatever, all of the rest of your
If,
program could be
fatal.
pound if, or pound if def,
Not
fatal
defined
or whatever, yeah, and basically, so then the compiler would not see the rest of the code. The only thing that it would see would be this. So you'd get the one error message out clearly, like, hey, man, you're running on the wrong chip. I mean, you're trying to compile for the wrong chip.
Okay, that's a good idea.
Similar to the way the headers prevent them from including themselves.
Twice. Another thing that I frequently do is I have multiple revs of my circuit boards. Maybe I've done some relay out, and so the pin assignments have changed a little bit. And so you can define what rev board you want to compile for. And then if I'm in rev 1, I know my LED's on pin 13. If I'm rev 2, I've moved it over to pin 7. Just a collection of different configurations based on what revision. That's very similar to the previous one, but it's a slightly different, a different use. And then a lot of times you'll want to have some debug stuff enabled while you're debugging, but then when you want to deploy it, you don't want to have all that debug stuff. So I do something like pound define debug at the top, and you can either be a 0 or a 1, depending on whether I want to have my debug statements or not. And then down in the code, if debug, and I print out my message. If debug is not, if it's defined as 0, then I wouldn't get that code compiled in.
Question real quick, that F that you have in there is special. I forget exactly how. Could you explain that?
Sure. Yeah, the F is special. That instead of putting, it tells the compiler instead of putting that string on the heap, it puts it into program space. So it's one of the ways of saving your precious RAM. Although on the chips I use, program space is pretty precious as well. But that's what it's for. Similar thing, you can, so here's a pound include that only gets brought in if you define that you want to use a feature, very similar to the previous one. And that's fine. Any questions?
I was reading an article, I was talking to you guys about the article about different boards.
Yep.
There's an online system to compile your Arduino code and be able to download it to your board. It works for other multiple boards, and this code will work in that as well. So if anybody's working with non-Arduino IDEs, some of the other IDEs will accept this kind of macro code as well.
Okay. One thing I will mention, I've heard people say, oh, pound if doesn't work in the Arduino IDE. And Pete told me that one time.
Yeah, that was bad information.
And it was bad information, but there's a grain of truth there. Okay? The IDE takes your .ino files, which are your sketches, right? And it converts them into the file that gets sent to the preprocessor in the compiler. And it puts some stuff at the top. Well, it has some logic to figure out where at the top is. And sometimes these C preprocessor lines get it confused and it puts its stuff in the wrong place. And so I've seen on the, what I typically do, if I have that problem, and I tried to reproduce it for this talk, and I was unable to. So, but I'm sure in the coming weeks, it'll catch me again. What I typically have done in the past is just do an int space junk semicolon up near the top before I do my pound defines and stuff. And that always seems to fix it. It just, kind of needs to know where your code starts for some reason. On the web, they said if you stick this at the top, that was their technique for getting it to work properly. John?
GCC has a command line switch where you can tell it to dump the results of the preprocessor.
Yes.
Do you know, is there a way to get your Arduino IDE to, if you want to debug what's, it could be helpful to go, oh, that's what's going on.
And as soon as I can reproduce it, what I will do is the IDE creates a text file which has its stuff and then your stuff. Okay? And I want to see what that is and what it did wrong. And I know where to go find that, but I just can't. I haven't been able to get a case where it does it wrong in the recent past. So I can better understand what it's doing that's wrong. Yes, Scott?
There is a project on SourceForge it's a CMake system that kind of emulates or acts like the Arduino IDE, and they're trying to keep up with all the different versions of the Arduino IDE. So as you could see what that intermediate step is and what the code looks like with standard make flags and so forth, preprocessor flags.
And I would not be surprised if there isn't a way to do it within the IDE, going and editing some of their.
I know on Windows how to capture the command line that's getting, how to spy on all the processes. And you can, what I've done in the past is capture that.
Replay it yourself and add flags as necessary.
But I don't know how to do it within I avoid the Arduino GUI as much as I can.
The reason why I mentioned that is there was people now that are using Qt Creator with CMake to emulate the Arduino IDE, or actually compile the same kind of code as Arduino IDE, but it gives you a lot more flexibility to do stuff the Arduino IDE can't do.
So I mentioned if you want to get the processor definitions, there's this file io.h which has this big switch of if this processor is defined, do this, if this processor is defined. And I just grepped for _ADR_, and you get 60 or 70 different strings. So if you want to figure out what the possible range of processors is.
I'd love to see what the Galileo
That
enabled
file.
IDE looks like for those header files and processor types.
All right, any other questions? Thank you.
One quick comment, very good demo, by the way. Do you know whether or not the CPU processor for Arduino supports variadic macros? Those are macros with variable number arguments.
It's GNU CPP.
Yeah, it's
So,
using the standard.
yes.
It's GNU CPP, but also the variable the variable parameter mechanism is, there's a library for that. In many of these environments, a lot of stdlib, the standard libraries are there, including
I was saying,
varargs,
He's-
the
he's-
varargs.
in the CPU processor,
He's
I'm
talking about
variable arguments.
very likeness to the
You
C
can do that in
processor
CPP as well.
in pound
It's the
defined.
GCC C3.
So that's, so you mentioned the debug, that's why I like the debug, where I actually have pound define debug out, and basically I just call debug out with a standard printout type mechanism. And I set debug out to be nothing, well, I don't turn debug on, I just say debug out, which other things got to do my code, and that's what I tend to do.
Yes.
Or things like that, basically, another way of doing it, so.
There's a whole nother presentation you could do on just pound defined.
Yeah.
Those macros can do all kinds of crazy things.
I have something I thought of, years as C++ developer. One, I love getting crazy with preprocessor, but one of the gotchas can be that the code does not actually get compiled if it's not active, so you can get bit rot in places that are infrequently turned on. If you make changes, you won't necessarily catch.
Yeah, and timing changes when you pull out the serial prints, and the size of the heap changes when you pull out serial prints. And, so you're having a problem and you stick in a print statement, and then your program totally doesn't run anymore because your heap and your stack have overrun each other, and it doesn't tell you that happened, and just, so there's a lot of things that these low-level microprocessors.
One of the nice things about the QT creator instead of the Arduino IDE is being able to use GDB on it.
There's one compiler option, I mean, this would be hard to pull off within the IDE. But if you can insinuate an option into the GCC compile command, I think it's capital P, that basically says, give me a copy of the text that the compiler is going to see. In other words, what came out of the preprocessor.
Come back to a file.
That can often keep you from prematurely aging as you're trying to figure out some of these issues.
In the same vein, there's also another option to cause it to stop upon an error in the directives.
To cause GCC to stop.
The CPP part.
I was a little surprised that pound error didn't terminate the compile as soon as it did.
It's setting the actual flag to go the other way and continue on. The IDE is. I wish I could find the definition files where they're defining the command line for.
Okay. And I will post this presentation to the website.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.